So in this video, I wanted to go more in depth about gaming performance when you can't overclock or don't want to overclock. Basically, I want to know how the CPU actually affects gaming performance in comparison to just swapping out a better GPU. So I was prompted to make this video because of my last video where I built a X79 budget build, and the motherboard I used was a Chinese motherboard that did not have any voltage control. So overclocking was quite limited. So naturally, gaming performance depends on a lot of different things, but the number one thing is the GPU. There is a point with a higher end GPU and a lower end CPU that the CPU will affect the performance of the GPU. So in this test, we're going to be using two different CPUs and two different GPUs. So for the GPUs, we're going to be using a 1080 here and the 290X that I used in the build video, my last video. We're also going to be using the 1620 V2, which will be at stock settings because we can't overclock it. And we're going to be using the 7740X, and we're going to be overclocking that to 5 gigahertz. And we're just going to test the difference between the CPUs using the same GPU. So naturally, the newer CPU here, the 7740X, will perform better than the older CPU. It's a newer CPU, it's way faster. That's what we expect, that's what's going to happen. But I want to see more the actual differences between having a older CPU and say a 1080, which is a higher end GPU, and having a newer CPU and having a lower end GPU, which would be the 290X. So let's start the benchmarks. So first up is the new game Apex Legends. Using the 290X and the 1620 V2, we did get a very respectable 74 average FPS at 1080p. The 7740X got 100 FPS average. Although this is quite a bit higher than the 1620 V2, either FPS would be perfectly fine to play at. But if we look at the frame times, we can see there's a huge difference in the 1% and 0.1% lows. So using the 1620 V2 was a very stuttering, unplayable experience that you really wouldn't want to play the game at. Now, if we look at the same game using the GTX 1080, using the same settings as before, there's actually very little performance difference between the two CPUs in the 1% and 0.1% lows. Even though we have a 11 and 20% difference in the 1% and 0.1% lows, the 1620 V2 still got 77 and 54 FPS for the lows, making it perfectly playable and very smooth. We also didn't see that much of a difference in the average FPS using a higher end GPU and the two different CPUs. Next up, we have Battlefield 1 using DX11 at 1080p. Using the 290X, we can see that the 1720 V2 frame times were a lot more spread out than the 7740X. We also see more consistent 1%, 0.1% average FPS with the 7740X. Although the differences are a lot smaller than the previous game, and playing with either CPU was not really noticeable difference in gameplay. Now using a GTX 1080 playing Battlefield 1, we see something very different. So firstly, using a 7740X, the average FPS was more than 50 FPS higher. We also see that the 7740X got higher lows for the FPS percentage. I should say, however, that using the 1620 V2, gameplay was perfectly fine, and the 0.1% lows were still at 57 FPS. So for Project Cars 2, using the 290X, we can see that the average FPS was not that difference between the two CPUs. But again, we see that the 1%, 0.1% lows are a lot higher with the 7740X than with the 1620 V2. Using the GTX 1080 with Project Cars behaved a lot differently. So firstly, using the 7740X, we averaged 153 FPS, and the 1620 V2 averaged 97 FPS. But again, we see the low FPS percentages were a lot higher with the 7740X. While both CPUs with the GTX 1080 allowed the game to perform perfectly fine, we really see that the 7740X allowed the 1080 to stretch its legs. Now, lastly, we have Doom. This one was a bit interesting. So between the two CPUs, using a 290X, we almost see no difference in FPS. Though the frame times do seem a lot tighter if you look at the graph with the 7740X. If we actually look at the average low FPS, we don't really see too much of a difference. So my guess is that what happened with this was the GPU was running basically at its limits, so the CPUs didn't really matter too much. Now using the 1080, we see that the graphs are very different than before. So using the 7740X, we got nearly double the average FPS. But the low FPS average numbers are quite close together. But if we look at the graph, we can see that the 7740X, the lowest frame times rarely dropped lower than the highest frame times of the 1620 V2. Although both were perfectly playable, even using the 1620 V2, we were getting an average of 102 FPS. Okay, so those are the benchmark numbers, and what they tell us is basically what we already know, and that's higher end GPU equals higher FPS. So if you want high FPS, get a better GPU. But this also tells us something about the CPU. So the first thing is the faster and the newer CPU was more consistent. So you had higher low FPSs. So that means the game is more smooth and you don't see a drop in FPS. This was true even with the older GPU, and using a newer GPU just amplified this effect. So it was even more consistent and there was even a greater difference. Another thing that we saw with these benchmarks was the games themselves, the difference in the games. So for example, Apex Legends didn't really seem to care too much which CPU we used. Yes, there were still differences. Yes, the newer, faster one performed better, but there was less of a difference than, say, in Battlefield 1, where we saw huge differences. So let's look at cost next. So cost-wise, the 1620 V2 usually goes for about $50. And since we used a Chinese motherboard, it's about $100 for the motherboard. So that brings that setup to about $150. Now for this review, I used a 7740X, which is essentially just a 7700K on X299. It's a silly CPU, you shouldn't use it for gaming, but it's essentially the same thing as a 7700K, it just overclocks better. So for the price, we're going to use the price of a 7700K and a Z270 board. So if we go online to eBay, we see that the 7700Ks go for around $380 to $400, and it really depends on the motherboards. Prices vary quite a bit, but you seem to be able to pick up a Z270 board for about $50 to $60. Personally, I think a 7700K isn't worth $380. That's just too much. I wouldn't pay that much for it. But that seems to be what they're going for on eBay. So that means that it's about $350 for the 7700K setup. Now with that setup, you will have to use DDR4. It's going to make it more expensive than DDR3, but prices are going down for DDR4, so it's probably not that bad. But DDR3 is still quite a bit cheaper than DDR4. So, is it worth it to have a newer, faster CPU with a higher end GPU versus a low end CPU and a high end GPU? Based on these benchmarks, obviously the GPU was the #1 factor in FPS and how well the game played. I don't think anybody has any real doubts about that. Everybody knows that if you want higher FPS, get a better GPU. That's just how it is. But the newer CPU did have almost consistently always higher low FPSs, so it give you a smoother experience even with a lower end GPU. But the difference in price between the two setups, in this case, was about $200. So is it really worth it to spend $200? Maybe if you are one of those people that play 144 FPS and you don't want your low FPSs to drop below 60, then it's probably worth it. But honestly, I think most people will be better served getting a higher end GPU and just leaving the CPU alone. However, we saw this in the benchmarks. The lower end CPU can hold back the GPU. So you can have a really high end GPU and a slow older CPU, and even though your FPSs will all be higher, the game will play perfectly fine. If you put in a higher end CPU, all of a sudden that GPU performs a lot better. So up to a certain point, it is worth it to upgrade the CPU, but I think we need to find a balance between CPU and GPU performance. So if you like this video, click the like button, subscribe, write your comments down below, tell me what you thought. Until next time.